Welcome to Stay Sharp in Digital Engineering, your insider's edge on all things digital in the world of engineering, products, and manufacturing. In this episode of Stay Sharp, we unpack a unique view on PLM, which we have called Deconstructed PLM. This whole idea started with a conversation between Jonathan Scott and Steve Nichols from our government division. So we invited Steve to the podcast to dive deeper into this concept and hopefully shift your view on how you might think about PLM and its capabilities. Let's jump right in. Welcome back, everybody, to Stay Sharp in Digital Engineering with our Razorleaf team. I'm here with my co-host, Jonathan Scott.
Hey, everybody.
And we also have today with us another one of our colleagues, Steve Nichols. Hey, Steve.
Hey, folks.
Steve is part of our Razorleaf government business. And today Jonathan and Steve have come up with a very interesting topic that I think I'll let them explain.
Yeah, no, this is going to be fun, I think. So the genesis of this topic, and you've probably figured it out if you've looked at the title of the podcast and you're listening to it already, but Steve and I have had some good conversations in the past about interesting uses of PLM systems, right? So we've on the podcast before talked about all the components and pieces that make up PLM. And, people listening to that probably think, oh, yeah, that's interesting. But if you take a different twist on it, if you think about something Steve brought up to me recently, that what else does it get used for? When people aren't using PLM to manage the life of the product, kind of from design and inception on into getting it ready for manufacturing, through manufacturing and into service, and that typical life cycle, what else can it be used for? What are people using it for? And then what does that really mean is kind of behind the scenes? What are those pieces that make up PLM, and how could they be used in other ways? So when Steve brought this up, I thought this is a great topic. This is a fun one to dig into. So Steve, thanks for being with us today to jump into this. And I'll let you start, right? When you think about this topic, kind of what brought this up for you? Like what makes you think, oh yeah, people need to think about PLM. It got some different perspectives to it.
Yeah, so I get out and talk to a lot of different organizations and a lot of different people with a lot of different backgrounds. And so depending on who I'm talking with, and they say, okay, what do you guys specialize in? And I usually say, PLM or engineering software. And some of the time they get it, and some of the time they start asking other questions based on kind of what their viewpoint is. And so to use the term as PLM software doesn't necessarily always resonate, and you don't get something out of the term itself or out of the title. So I start to talk about the software itself as a set of capabilities. And so I say, okay, when we start to engage with our customers, we install software that brings a set of capabilities to what they're trying to do to run their business. And those capabilities are as follows. So when I start to talk through the capabilities themselves that are inherent in PLM software, but aren't necessarily, a part of the title itself. And so it really helps the folks that I'm talking to start to kind of become a part of the conversation or get included in the conversation when I start talking about capabilities, such as workflow management, such as reporting, configuration management, but not necessarily mechanical. Think about all the things you do, like how many times do you work on a process? How many times do you work on, with a team, work on updating a process, updating other things? Well, this type of software brings all those capabilities to the conversation. And while we think about PLM usually as a single entity, it actually brings a lot of different things to a conversation or that can be applied to an organization. And so I start to break it out in ways that are meaningful.
So, hey, Steve, I want to jump in on that and just bring more to that context, like where you're coming from there, because, you do, and I do, we do speak to people who are outside of that design function, right? Which is where a lot of people think of the traditional PLM. But just to give folks a context of maybe some folks that you're talking to, you may still be talking to people who care a lot about the life cycle of a product. It's just they're coming at it from a different perspective, right? I just want to throw one out there that I'm thinking of. And you could probably think of a few other examples, but people who are receiving a product, right? People who are receiving something complex. I can think of a case of this from the energy world, right? You're receiving a plant. You're receiving a chemical plant, a power plant, something really complex like that. and you need to manage it and maintain it over its life. But you've got to receive this data, and it's a non-traditional use of PLM. I think you see that some on the government side, right? The government's receiving a very complex machine, and they need to have the data for it. So it's still PLM, even in its context, but when you flip it around and look at it from this non-design angle, it looks different or can look different, right?
It really can. And so that's a great example of being the recipient of something else, of someone else's data for that product, right? And so getting that data and being able to not only preserve its life cycle and its history, the heredity of that data that you are receiving, but then being able to take it and move it forward with the certifications, with the processes you have, with requirements for sign-offs and all those kind of things, as you then move the data forward or move the product forward, but also want to keep the data up to date so that you've got that particular view. You're applying all of those capabilities. You may not necessarily be starting with the traditional blank screen design and moving forward, but knowing what the requirements were that led you to where you were today, the data that you got, the design, the manufacturing, all of that is relevant to moving forward. It just, when you happen to pick it up. And all of that's associated. So when you get that data has a structure to it. And that data kind of has a little bit of a personality. And you want to be able to preserve that structure and personality and carry it forward because there's value there. You already invested in that. You may as well benefit from it.
And that's where those capabilities that you mentioned come in, right? This is sort of the natural use of them. It's maybe use in a different way than people would think about traditionally, but bill of material management and CAD management and those kinds of things still fit. It's just a little different take on it when you're not trying to design, you're not trying to iterate so much, that kind of thing.
Right. Well, you're still iterating, right? But you're iterating starting at a different point in that whole life cycle. So you're stepping in, you're picking up ownership and authorship of that whole life cycle just from a midpoint of some sort, right? But you still have the requirements and the need to know what happened in the past. You just happen to be the artist writing the book going forward from that point, right?
As what I like about that approach is it allows you to have that conversation at the problem level. So you're not, a lot of times with PLM, it's just this big monster problem you're trying to solve. And so, it usually starts with the design side and, the drawings and interfacing with CAD and all that stuff. So, but it allows it to really get down to the data problem and look at the business a little bit differently when you take it apart like that.
Well, and Julianne, that makes a lot of sense, right? And you're starting to think about the deconstruction component of the overall issue. It also, when you think about PLM from the beginning, it is this big kind of amorphous kind of concept, and everybody has an idea of it. What do you think? And this and that, and then you have opinions. When you pick it up and you start to break it apart into its capabilities as opposed to the overall suite, you then have the ability to start to tackle some of those needs, some of those requirements without having to think about the overwhelming component of all at once. It no longer becomes an all or nothing conversation. It becomes what can we start to do to solve pains today, knowing that you put a couple of these pieces in place, and as time goes on, you can start to add and move around without being overwhelmed with it. So let's solve today's issue, knowing that today's issue leads you to solutions or benefits you in solutions in the future.
Yeah, so Steve, that makes sense, right? That when you break those down, you can start to see things in a new light. And I can think of one example that I know you and I've talked about in the past that really kind of highlights that. And the capability I think of is structure, right? The ability to manage a structure and a composite view of some things. And so I'm going to let you explain this one because I think you know the example better than I do. But let's talk about geospatial data, maps, things like that you might need to manage that might change over time, and what PLM or a PLM capability can bring to that sort of solution and problem set. Can you give us some thoughts on that one?
Yeah, so Jonathan, that's a great example. When you think about a map per se, you think about it as a pretty static representation of what's going on. But when we use mapping information, such as the mapping apps on our phones, that data is constantly updated and constantly going through revisions. What business is at that location? Has that changed? What are the streets in that location? Is it now a traffic circle versus a four-way stop versus something else? What's the terrain? Terrain changes as well. And when you start to think about greater geographic regions, what's the population there? What's the flow during the seasons? Is there greater population, less population? As you think about those regions, what's the water like? Things that are going to be from the granular level to what business is in that building to, can we support a city? Can we support a structure, a port, those kind of things in this area? You really start to think about data that's highly managed, is updated or can be updated frequently, but yet still and you want to know what the heredity of that update is to make sure that it makes sense, but yet also then provide a picture for somebody to actually be able to use it over time or use it when they need it right now. And so you need confidence in today, but you need to know how we got here in case there's a question that's asked. And so thinking about all those different layers that go into a geographic representation of an area is the same as thinking about all the different layers that went into building a helicopter or building an automobile, right? You would think about them geographic layers, but on a helicopter, you've got a landing gear, you've got cockpit, you've got hydraulics, you've got electronics. Those different components that come together to form a whole are no different than all the different layers that go into creating or supporting geographic information, just as an example, right? And so when you start to break away from the physical component and think about what's the data look like and the process look like, you're really looking at the digital representation here, and then you have a lot of flexibility in applying the capabilities of PLM.
Well, it gets you back to the capabilities, like you said, that are solving an interesting problem. Maybe in some cases, a problem this sounds like a solution looking for a problem. Maybe it is, but a problem maybe somebody couldn't well define. But to your point, like with maps and geospatial data, if I can manage those changes over time, that also means I could probably go back to a certain point in time, right? So if I want to see map A overlaid with map B, with map C, some particular configuration of that information, wait, I just said configuration, like configuration management. There's a capability, and this is how we sort of get to that. Well, isn't that an interesting use, right?
Yeah, very much so. And really kind of thinking through it and think about, just like you have on a complex mechanical design, such as that helicopter we referenced earlier, the geographic representation has a whole bunch of authors. Those authors are in different places. They have different source data coming in for geographic and geospatial. They're also going to have imagery coming in. They're going to have different layers, different contributors. And all of those things kind of come together in ways that when you look at it in a snapshot, all makes sense. But when you start to look back in time, how did we get here? You want to know, where did that come from? What's the time on it? Who authorized it? Who signed off on it? Did that make sense? Is that data source trustworthy or not? You got all of those questions that could be asked. And the PLM system has the capabilities to record all that. Do you need it on a Sunday afternoon while you're out for a hike? Probably not. But if somebody's trying to look at a wildfire or manage one of those types of things, they've got all of that history back there that they can look at it and react appropriately.
So I'm going to throw one in here, an example that I remember from, I'm going to say maybe even 10 years ago that I thought was an interesting application. The deconstruction, right, the PLM capabilities that were in use were really about the security model, right? And the fact that the PLM that was being used in this case, and a lot of them are this way today, was sort of an object-oriented database on top of a relational database backend. But what was interesting about that was the security model that was available to that object-oriented database, meaning you could be very granular about letting somebody look at one piece of the data and not another. So that's really the thing that was interesting here. The application was electronic medical records, right? So the idea being that we could store electronic medical records in a PLM system and have very granular control over who could see what the patient could see, what the medical professional could see, what the insurance company could see, who had access over these various pieces, and how was it secured, and the good relationships that you needed to events about office visits and all these kinds of things. So I won't get all into the details, but that was another one where the capabilities, right, that sort of object-oriented model where you could model the medical records with the security capability is what made it interesting.
Right, yeah, very much so. So you're starting to back up and think about the capabilities of PLM applied to a wide variety of different situations. And so you're exactly right. I mean, so what's the end product there, right? Is it the patient themselves, and then other people can see various views of what that patient happens to represent in the digital realm, right? You think about that as supply chains as well. Right, so a supplier back in to providing some information, whether it's mechanical or a patient, whatever they're looking at, can see certain things, but not other things, whether it's intellectual property or HIPAA or whatever it happens to be. PLM does that really well, and so it's that deconstruction of those capabilities, application of capabilities in smaller sets that lead you to that outcome.
I'm finding this really interesting because it really kind of breaks down the data at its base levels and how it's going to get consumed by the end user, which we actually talked about with Rob McAvaney a couple of weeks ago about on the digital thread and managing the digital traceability of information. But I think that it allows us to really look at, it can even be just integration. You might just need to push this data to somewhere else, and the capability needed is integration. So it really forces you to look at the case, the use case, or how people want to consume that piece of information.
Well, and yeah, Julian, really to your point, it goes back to what are the capabilities that PLM software brings to the conversation. And do you need to use them all at once? Or can you pick and choose with what makes sense? Integration, PLM systems are supposed to be good at integrating and getting data from other systems or tying those in. Well, can you use that PLM system as an integration component between other systems? There's reporting capability there. Can you use that to report? Even if the PLM isn't holding the data, can you apply those reporting capabilities to other questions and other data sets, right? So it's really starting to think about how do we take that capability and segregate it from others, but still apply it to the problem we have today?
So that one reminds me this idea of separating those things and then thinking about how you build them up in an interesting way. Reminds me of another conversation we had in the past, Steve, that was sort of a play off of the word digital twin, right? And I think the thing you and I were talking about was not electronic medical records, but identity management. But the idea that a digital twin, we all, hear it today and think about, it's a, virtual replica of a plane or an engine or a ship or whatever. But what about people, right? A digital twin of a person, of a fingerprint, of a facial recognition, of a model of your scan of your, X-ray or something. Like, all of these capabilities, we start to, when you mentioned product earlier, I'm like, yeah, if you think about the human as the product, the person as the product, well, digital twin takes on a whole new connotation. Now, maybe that's getting us off the topic of deconstructed PLM and into a broader deconstruction, but I think it's a logical, place to go when you think, how could these tools and capabilities be applied other ways?
Jonathan, I think it's spot on, right? You're starting to walk away from the mechanical, the traditional, what we think about with PLM, and think about, okay, so if that product becomes kind of the variable, what does it mean to be a product? Is the product a thing? Is it a person? Is that product a process? Is that product an outcome of something else, right? And so you start to break away from the traditional, and you start to open up the idea of, well, what is that product? Then you start to think about, well, I could apply this capability in this way, because we're now thinking about it towards the human or towards the map or towards the process or whatever it happens to be. And you think about the capabilities that are there, it actually becomes a whole lot of fun to start to think about, what could we be doing here, because we're bringing these to the conversation, but we're not constrained by someone's product line anymore, or what we were thinking about in the past. So it really becomes kind of fun. It's a great whiteboard exercise to think about the benefits you get from picking and choosing capabilities that are needed today.
So I'm going to jump in on that, and I'm not trying to summarize the episodes. I don't want to cut us off yet, but I want to come back to all the things we've talked about and kind of highlight those capabilities just to see if there's any I missed, because hopefully it'll get the audience thinking like, okay, how do you connect this, right? Because we've talked about some interesting applications, but I've heard bill of material management used in a new way. I've heard file management, just revisions and files and documents. We talked about the maps, that maps. I hear when we talk about like digital twin and models of scans and things, I think about 3D visualization. There's another capability. I think we talked about workflow, right? Ingesting things, moving things along, automating processes. What did I miss, Steve? What other capabilities have we sort of talked around as we've been talking today that could be reused in some of these applications?
Yeah, we talked about reporting, thinking about that reporting capability and tying not only to kind of in-house reporting, but also feeding other reporting engines. So that and you keep in mind, you can start to use some BI. So you could use the reporting capabilities here to feed some type of bigger picture enterprise BI that might not be able to understand associated data sets, but might get value from the reporting out of those. We also talked about thinking about legacy system integration. How do you start tying stuff together without necessarily pulling it all or subsuming it all into the PLM system? Can you still get value out of some of that, right? And maybe from system A to system C, with PLM being system B in the middle, but you're using the integration capabilities, not necessarily all the other things that come in a traditional PLM implementation. So those are some stuff that we've talked about as well, or you could use.
I think that's cool stuff, right? Thinking about all of those in non-traditional ways. And, I think out of all the ones we just listed, we probably covered, 10, 15% of kind of the traditional capabilities of PLM. There's a bunch more, right? And it's out there for people to think about, wait, how else can this apply?
Right. Yeah, once you start breaking it down, keep in mind, this is kind of like if you think about PLM as kind of a commercial kitchen. In that commercial kitchen, they've got ovens, they've got mixers, they've got different size pans, different size utensils, all those kind of things. Most of the time, people go to that commercial kitchen and they don't think about all the stuff that's there. They ask for a cake, and they expect the outcome as a cake. They might want 2 tiers, 3 tiers, 4 tiers. But when you take a step back, you actually have all of those capabilities in there that you can apply to a wide variety of outcomes. We just think about it as being a cake or some bread or a dish, a meal of sorts. But you've really got all those capabilities to apply in a wide variety of ways. You don't have to use them all, but you can kind of pick and choose and ask for different outcomes when you think about everything that was applied to get to the first outcome. You can take that step back and think about what went into that outcome and start to utilize those pieces. That, to me, is what PLM really is.
I like that. I like that viewpoint and that thought, right? Because it gives us something, it gives us more than maybe what was intended, right? By the PLM software writers, the folks that put it together in the first place. They were, of course, trying to make their tools flexible, but I really like this idea of, okay, break it down, look at it in capabilities, and you might come up with a lot more that's sort of creative and useful. And my favorite part of this is, this reminds me, I struggled for years when I would hear people use the word extensible, right? I'd hear it a lot as a buzzword, and I'm like, what extensible? What are you really trying to say? To me, that's exactly what you're talking about, Steve, right? Is reusing something beyond what it was designed for initially. And that's what we're talking about.
Exactly. It's one of the, when I hear, usually a lot of PLM conversations start up around, oh, we gotta get our parts and my accent's coming out, my parts and bombs.
I love it.
Sorry, Boston. So yeah, we got to start off with parts and bombs and change management. But it's so uninteresting, right? When you come up with those topics, it's like, oh, it's just that. But when you start talking about, the commercial cake, commercial bakery you're talking about, it's like, well, it could be a chocolate cake with fondant, print, and all this stuff. It could be much more interesting when you start breaking apart the pieces.
Does that just mean we're hungry?
It might be. The whole cake thing got me going. So
we're going to need this podcast sponsored by one of the bakery companies, right?
Yeah, exactly.
That's right. So normally at this point, we try and sort of summarize. Now, I will say, I think we just did some of that, right, by talking about those capabilities. But I'll take a shot at a few quick words on this. So this all got spawned, Steve, by you and I talking about this idea of the number of places we've seen people use PLM, but in a non-traditional sense, and how good of a fit it is in many cases. It's not, somebody may listen to the whole episode and say, guys, this is awful. You're talking about using technology for its unintended purpose. But I don't think that's the case, right? I think it's actually a really good fit in places where there's not a specific solution, or maybe it's not a broad enough problem to warrant a targeted solution, but PLM has some of the answers. And with off-the-shelf tools, you can just apply them in a unique way and get a really good solution. And we talked about a variety, right? From just sort of a slightly different angle on real product lifecycle management and managing the product, but in a different way or a different part of its life, towards getting a little more interesting with things like geospatial data, or we didn't really talk about it, but we've got another example of metrology and calibration data. I think there's a couple more. Electronic medical records we talked about. Maybe I missed some, but all those interesting use cases, when you look at why there was a fit, it was through the breakdown of capabilities. And I think we listed a couple of those. I won't go through that list again, but the kinds that we've seen, the pieces that we've seen used of PLM to help sort of support these interesting use cases. And for me, I think that's really interesting, and I hope it sort of spurs our audience to think about what problems do you have in maybe other parts of your business where there's a fit, not a misfit, right? Don't go try and make everything look like a nail just because you got a hammer in your hand. But are there cases where, you know what, that capability really matches that need, and I've already got the tool, or I know where I can get a tool to do it. So for me, that's what we were talking about today. But Steve, what did I miss? What out of the things we talked about, put the icing on this cake?
Since we're in a cake mode.
You started it.
I did start it, actually. As the son of a dentist, I mean, it's all about the Jonathan, I think you summed it up. It's really thinking kind of, out of the box a little bit and saying, okay, I own, or I know where to get these types of solutions. Don't think about it as one big solution to solve one big problem. Start to think about, what do you need today? And can we take this solution, but start to solve today's issue today in a smaller sub-segment, right? So don't let it overwhelm with everything it can do. Let's pick out the 3 things it can do today and apply them, and then start moving. Because otherwise you're just overwhelmed with the topic and the capability set, and you just can't move forward.
Great. Well, it's a great summary. And the image that comes to mind is this, you think about contractors and they have all these different tools, and it's like a utility tool belt. You can pull out the wrench, you can pull out the hammer, you can, whatever you need to help, solve some of those specific problems people might be having around data, moving data around, and consuming data. So great. Well, thank you so much, Steve, for joining us today and having us delve into this interesting topic of deconstructing PLM, not cakes, but PLM. And Jonathan, always, it's great to have you. And thanks for joining us all the way from Germany. And we appreciate it. We look forward to seeing you back here on the stateside in another couple of weeks, or another week, right?
Absolutely.
Yes. All right. And with that, we're going to close our episode, and hope everybody does well out there. Thank you for joining us, and stay sharp. Bye, everybody.
Thanks again, Steve.
Thanks for being here and listening to this episode of Stay Sharp with Razorleaf. If you like this podcast, please be sure to hit the like button or subscribe to our podcast on your favorite podcast platform, or check us out on YouTube. If you have any questions or want to leave a comment on our post, please do, or send us an email to podcast@razorleaf.com. We'd love to hear from you. Until next time, stay sharp.